Hey, what's up, you guys? Welcome to the channel Pick Your Own Cotton. My name is Carissa. So I posted a video on TikTok saying that I didn't know African American Black people, not all of our last names came from the enslavers. Why did I think that every Black person got their enslaver's last name? We all know that a lot of Black people got their last names from their enslavers. But what I didn't know was a lot of the common names, Carter, Smith, Taylor, came from Black people's ancestors' occupations. So in case you didn't know, a carter was a person who transported goods using a cart. Cooper is someone who made or repaired barrels. Smith is in relation to a blacksmith, someone who worked with metal. Tailor refers to a tailor, someone who sews and makes clothing. And then you have names like Freeman, Strong, Young, Brown, Black. These represent exactly what it sounds like. And I was surprised to see how many people also didn't know that. Actually, I wasn't that surprised because, I already know how the system that we all grew up in is with miseducating us. But it was surprising to me to see the impact of the video. My ancestors kept their last name Jackson, and it's been passed down through several generations. My dad has actually been able to trace our family lineage back to the plantation because of the last name. He's found the plantation of the first plantation owner and his son and their family, and the 36 slaves that his son owned, which was my family members. So it's a clue to just learning my history and who my ancestors were. So if you didn't see or hear your name in this video, there is a more extensive list in the blog post, pickyourown.cotton.com. Go there, check out the blog, see if you can find any more information on your name there, or just do a simple Google search. Hopefully that will give you a key or a clue to start tracing your lineage. If you're like me, you probably grew up thinking that your last name came straight from the plantation. And if you're like me, your last name did come straight from the plantation, but there's more to the story. Keep watching. What I didn't know was that many of our ancestors didn't just inherit the names of their enslavers, they chose their own, rejecting the identities that were forced upon them. On the plantation, slaves were not even given last names in most cases. It wasn't until after they left that these names were obtained, and many of them chose their own names as a way to reject their former slave identities and their former masters, because they knew that once they walked off those plantations, they were whole human beings, not property, not 3/5 of a person, but free individuals determined to define their own legacies. Understanding the origins of our last names is more than just an historical curiosity. It's a crucial part of reclaiming lost ancestral connections and unraveling the layers of Black identity today. Our names are not just markers of who we are. They're powerful symbols of a resilient and resistant people who have always valued self-identity and independence. If you tried researching your family lineage but hit a dead end, it might be due to the complexities of Black surnames. In this video, we're breaking down how Black Americans obtained their last names, what those names reveal about our ancestors, and why this history matters to us today. By the end of the video, I hope you'll have not only a clearer understanding of your own identity, but also a few tools to help you start tracing your lineage. Let's get into it. Before enslavement, most Africans followed traditional naming customs that deeply connected them to their lineage, culture, and spiritual beliefs. Names were not just identifiers, they carried meaning, history, and a sense of belonging. Many African names directly tied to family and clan structures, making it easy to trace one's ancestry through generations. Before the transatlantic slave trade, many African tribes, particularly the Igbo, Yoruba, Akan, and Iwi, retained Hebrew-influenced naming customs, reflecting their spiritual and ancestral identities. Names often included references to God using El or Yah, similar to biblical traditions. Even after enslavement stripped many of their identities, Black people in the Americas reclaimed biblical and Hebrew-based names, preserving a legacy that predates slavery and still shapes Black identity today. Others reflected significant events surrounding a child's birth, such as the circumstances of their arrival or the aspirations their parents held for them. Spiritual significance was also embedded in many African names, with some chosen to invoke blessings protection, or divine favor. Additionally, certain cultures used day naming traditions, where a child's name reflected the day of the week that they were born. Names like Kojo for Monday, Kweku for Wednesday, Kwame, Saturday born, or Kofi, Friday born. But when enslaved Africans were brought to the Americas, one of the first things stripped was their name, a deliberate attempt to erase their identity, lineage, and connection to God. The forced naming of enslaved Africans was a tool of control, reinforcing the idea that they were property rather than human beings. Here's how it happened. In many cases, enslaved individuals were branded with numbers rather than called by name, reducing them to inventory rather than recognizing them as people with personal histories. Ship records reflected this dehumanization, listing enslaved Africans as cargo rather than individuals with identities, stripping them of any link to their past. By the time they arrived in the Americas, their original names were often forgotten, forbidden, or forcibly replaced. Upon arriving in the Americas, enslaved Africans were often renamed by their enslavers. More often than not, enslaved people were not given surnames at all, an intentional act meant to further erase their lineage and keep them from establishing familial continuity. Those who did receive last names were often forced to take the name of their enslaver. This practice wasn't about granting enslaved people an identity so much as marking them as property. Just as an enslaver would brand livestock with their initials, assigning their surname to an enslaved person reinforced the notion of ownership. These names were not inherited through family ties, but rather imposed upon them, with no regard for their personal histories or desires. The renaming process was also fluid. An enslaved person could be sold multiple times throughout their life, and with each transaction, their name could change. This further destabilized any sense of self or heritage. If an enslaved family was separated, children sold away from parents, spouses torn apart, they had no shared last name to serve as a link back to one another. This intentional disruption made it nearly impossible for Black families to remain connected across generations. While we're here, let's talk about first names. One of the most common practices used by enslavers when assigning first names was the use of biblical or classical names. Enslaved people were often given names such as Isaac, Moses, Esther, Caesar, Venice, or Nero. In many cases, enslavers deliberately assigned dehumanizing names meant to mock or degrade those in captivity, such as boy. Others were given common English names like John, Mary, Tom, or Betty, which were generic and widely used in the white society. Names could change at any moment, often at the whim of the enslaver. If an enslaved person was sold to a new owner, they might receive an entirely new name, further severing any ties to their past. Some enslaved parents gave their children unique names, such as Minty, so that if they were ever separated, they'd be easier to find. Those who obtained their freedom and those who were never enslaved in the first place wore the name freeman or freedman, declaring their new status. By controlling names, enslavers controlled history, ensuring that the stories of Black families were fragmented and difficult to trace. Then came emancipation. During this critical time in history, freedmen now had the power to choose their own names, and for many, this was their first true act of self-determination. A name was more than a label. It was a declaration of freedom, an assertion of humanity, and for some, a direct rejection of the forced identities they had been given by cruel and evil enslavers. But life after the plantation was far from easy. Emancipation did not come with land, money, or resources. The vast majority of formerly enslaved people were left to fend for themselves with little more than the clothes on their backs and the skills they had developed through forced labor. Many had spent their entire lives cultivating crops, building infrastructure, crafting furniture, or blacksmithing, skills that were essential to the economy but had only ever benefited white society. Now, they had to figure out how to make those same skills work for their own survival. For most, the first priority after emancipation was finding lost family members. During slavery, families were frequently torn apart. Children were sold away from parents, spouses were separated, and siblings were scattered across different plantations. With no formal record keeping, many freedmen relied on oral history, word of mouth, and even newspaper ads in an attempt to reconnect with their loved ones. In cities and towns, former slaves posted notices reading, "Seeking my wife and 2 children, sold from me in Virginia in 1853," desperately hoping for a response. Some searched for years without success, while others traveled hundreds of miles, following rumors of where their relatives might have been taken. Beyond the search for family, basic survival was a daily struggle. Many freedmen had nowhere to live, as they had been forced to leave the plantations where they had once lived under bondage. Some built makeshift homes in the woods or along the roadsides. Others sought refuge in abandoned buildings or formed small communities known as freedmen's settlements, where they pulled their resources together. Food and water were scarce. Plantation owners still controlled most of the farmland, and without land of their own, many Black people had to take whatever work they could just to eat. Some resorted to hunting, fishing, or bartering services in exchange for food. Wells, rivers, and creeks were vital for drinking water, but access to clean water was often limited, particularly in areas where white landowners actively tried to push freedmen out. The lack of resources forced many freed Black people to rely entirely on their own communities. Since they received no assistance from the government or white society at large, they had to create their own support systems. Black churches became a cornerstone of these efforts, not only offering spiritual guidance, but also providing food, shelter, and a place for community organizing. Despite the hardships, many freedmen have found ways to turn the skills they learned in bondage into means of economic survival. Former slaves had been the backbone of the American economy for centuries. They had built plantations, harvested cotton and tobacco, constructed railroads, worked as blacksmiths, seamstresses, carpenters, and more. Now they sought to use those same skills for their own benefit. Many Black men took jobs in agriculture, continuing to work the land, but this time for wages, though often unfairly low. Others pursued skilled trades such as carpentry, bricklaying, and ironworking, building homes and businesses for the very people who once enslaved them. Black women often worked as cooks, laundresses, and midwives, serving Black and white families alike. Some former slaves became landowners themselves, pulling their money to buy property and start small farms. Others moved to cities in search of better opportunities, leading to the growth of Black business districts and self-sustaining communities. This entrepreneurial spirit would later give rise to the thriving Black economies in places like Tulsa's Greenwood District, Richmond's Jackson Ward, and Durham's Havey community. If you couldn't already tell, these struggles for survival and skills don't just tell a story of struggle. They represent identity. Those who took on skills such as blacksmiths, bakers, cooks, tailors, and carters took these occupations on as their identities. The areas they settled in carried significant meaning and were kept in the names: rivers, hill or hills, banks, and woods. Many formerly enslaved Black people chose or were assigned surnames based on their occupations. These names not only signified their skills, but also became identifiers of their newfound independence and self-sufficiency. Thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you liked it. I enjoyed making this. I learned a lot, and I hope you did too. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share the video. Please visit pickyourown.cotton.com, subscribe to the blog, learn more, stay connected with us. Pick Your Own Cotton on Instagram. Pick Your Own Cotton and stay Black and beautiful.